So the topic today is applications of nuclear radiation. Last week, we went over what nuclear radiation is, its penetrating abilities, and the instruments that we use to detect it. Just a quick recap. Alpha particles are the slowest because they are the largest radiation particles. So therefore, they don't travel very fast. They don't travel very fast. They also don't travel very far. And they have the least penetrative ability. So basically, they cannot even go through a piece of paper. Then you have beta particles, which can penetrate through paper and I think tissues as well. No, maybe not tissues. I can't remember. Anyway, the worst kind of radiation is gamma radiation because it's super high energy, very high frequency. If you remember back to grade 10, when I talked about the electromagnetic spectrum, because all forms of radiation are on that spectrum. I hear music. That's weird. So the EM spectrum, you start down here with microwaves, radio, and TV waves, and then you increase. There we go. Okay, so somewhere in the middle-ish, you've got visible light. And then up here, you've got X-ray, and at the very tippy top, that's your gamma ray. Now, gamma radiation, because it's such high frequency, it can penetrate everything up to like really thick cement walls and or lead. So the higher the frequency is, the more energy that's in the radiation. Down here where you've got like TV and radio, these are very long wavelengths, so very low frequency and not dangerous. Okay, so nuclear radiation has many applications based on the fact that the physical, and chemical properties of stable isotopes are the same as radioactive isotopes of the same element. So there's going to be three major categories of applications that we're going to look at, and I'll go through some examples. The first one is in radioactive dating. Number two is in medicine. There's actually an entire field of medicine called nuclear medicine, which is just all medical applications of nuclear radiation, including not just radiography with X-rays, but also like MRIs and CAT scans and all kinds of stuff, cancer treatments, things like that. And number three, maybe something that's not quite as obvious, is agriculture. So starting with radioactive dating, this is a process by which the approximate age of an object is determined based on the amount of certain radioactive nuclides that are present. All of this is going to be based on half-life. Now, a very important aspect of radioactive dating is that the relative, different isotopes, because they have different half-lives, are going to be used to radioactively date different types of objects. For example, if you are an archaeologist and you find something that you can approximate from, say, the age of Egyptians, which was, if I have to guess, I think around 3,000 years ago, you're not going to use something that has a half-life of like 500,000 years, because that's not going to be helpful for dating something that's within 3,000 years old. You're going to use an isotope that has a much shorter half-life. And another opposite example of that would be if you find a new fossil, which is potentially like one of the first life forms on Earth that's from 3 billion years ago, you're not going to use something that has a half-life of 50,000 years, because that, again, won't be useful. So the premise behind radioactive dating is that you are measuring the amount of accumulating daughter nuclides or the disappearance of a parent nuclide, and you're comparing that based on the half-life. So how much of the parent is left, or how much of the daughter nuclides have accumulated over a specific amount of time. One of the most widely used isotopes for carbon dating is carbon-14. It has a half-life of 5,715 years, and it can be used to estimate the age of organic material that's up to 50,000 years old. Now, why does it have to be organic? Because if something is inorganic, it's not going to contain carbon at all. So there would be no point in radioactively dating something that's inorganic with carbon-14, because you're just not going to find any carbon in there. Like I said, nuclides that have longer half-lives are going to be used to date older objects. Now you might be thinking, well, how the heck do we even choose based on what we find? Well, it completely depends on where in the world you are, what your field of specialty is. So for example, if you are an archaeologist that specializes in ancient Chinese architecture, and you are in China and you are digging in a place where there is recorded history of like an ancient civilization from 10,000 years ago, then you can roughly estimate that it will be at least around 10,000 or so years old. So it's just about relativism, like what you're looking at, what kind of things you're digging up, whether it's like dinosaur bones, in which case you're looking at like was it 65 million years old, things like that. Do you know what I mean? I hope that makes sense. We have used radioactive dating to date materials and even lunar rocks that are more than 4 billion years old. Now, one of the things I do want to point out, because somebody in grade 10 mentioned it last week, radioactive dating is a solid science. It has been proven with evidence. We know how radioactive decay works. We know what half-life is. We are able to identify all kinds of isotopes that have specific half-lives. It is a well-known science. However, you have crazy people out there, of course, like, you know, there's just tons of crazy people all over the world that believe all kinds of weird things. But somebody in grade 10 mentioned the fact that there are some people that believe that Earth is only 2021 years old. And that's because this year is 2021, that they think it's only that years old. There's even a guy in Australia, I think his name is Ken Ham. He built a museum that I think he calls the Ark, based on Noah's Ark that he built. He thinks that actually like literally happened. And yeah, that Earth is only a couple thousand years old, and he thinks that humans and dinosaurs were around at the same time. And when you ask people like that, well, how do you explain carbon dating? Then they just basically kind of ignore it and say that it's fake, or it's not accurate, or it just isn't real, that kind of thing. So the reason why I bring this up is because there is there's not only an epidemic of obviously viral proportions with coronavirus, but there's also a huge epidemic of a lack of scientific understanding that's going on, especially now, like during pandemic. I just found out the other day that I have a cousin who just refuses to get vaccinated because she says the mRNA is new, even though it's not new. I just posted an article on Facebook if you want to read it. Scientists have been researching this kind of technology for 30 years. They've already been doing this since the 90s. But the coronavirus only allowed us to actually apply the research that was being done. And then you have some people, let's say, especially in my country of America, who say that the virus isn't FDA approved. If you don't know, the FDA is the Federal Drug Administration. It's the part of the federal government that approves whether things are safe for people to use. And that is also not accurate. It has approval for emergency use because we're in the middle of a goddamn pandemic. That they've approved it for, like, you know, expedited or sped up use, that we can go ahead and use it because it's already been through trials. So people that aren't aware of how not just drug trials, but like vaccine trials and all of that work, it's like many, many, many years, if not decades, of research that goes into it before you even get to human trials. Never mind the fact that, of course, all of these vaccines would have to have had both a clinical animal stage of trials and human trials, where you have people that volunteer to be part of human trials. So you would take, it would be what's called a blind study. So you get, like, say, I don't know, like 1,000 people, and of the 1,000 people, you give a random 500 people placebo, which means that you're just injecting them with like, say, saline or something. And then the other 500 people would get the actual vaccine, and then you compare the results. And not even the people that are doing the injecting know who's who. And that's what keeps it a blind or even a double blind study, so that you don't know who's getting what and you just look purely at results. Anyway, the point being that this is not, I guess, common knowledge anymore, even though I would hope that most people going through school who have a basic understanding and take basic science classes understand that this is the kind of thing that happens. And unfortunately, because like I said, I think that there's an epidemic of just general ignorance about these kinds of things. And that's kind of where it helps to understand how these things work. I had a guy on Facebook in one of the groups that I'm part of who was like slagging off on the mRNA vaccine, saying it was unknown new technology. I was like, no, it actually, and I taught you guys how mRNA works. So you get how mRNA is the code for the amino acid sequence, and then it gets translated to the protein, right? And when it comes to vaccines, like why that would be helpful. So he didn't say anything to me after that. And I was very nice about it, like very teacherly, and hopefully he just understood kind of what I meant. But that's why it's important to be as educated as you possibly can and make sure that you're getting information from reliable sources. Anyway, so that's that topic. All right, here's a video explaining how radioactive dating works.
How do we know how old something is? For people, we'd ask to see their birth certificate. For trees, we'd count the rings. But how do we know how old a fossil is? Fossils have their own internal clock. Scientists can read it by looking at the ratio of two different types of carbon atoms. Of course, every living thing is made of carbon. Plants grab carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and use it to form complex organic molecules. Animals get their carbon by eating these plants. But there's more than one form of carbon. Most carbon atoms have 6 protons and 6 neutrons. We call this carbon-12. High up in the atmosphere, sometimes cosmic rays hit nitrogen atoms. This creates carbon with 6 protons and 8 neutrons. We call this carbon-14. Carbon-12 and carbon-14 behave alike, but carbon-14 has one unique and important attribute. It's unstable. So once an animal dies, the carbon-14 in its body will start to go away. Every 5,730 years on average, about half of the carbon-14 atoms will decay into nitrogen. This is its half-life. After one half-life, the animal will have about half the amount of carbon-14 it started with. After another half-life, it will have about a quarter. And after another half-life, it will have about an eighth. By contrast, the amount of carbon-12 it has in its body will stay the same. By measuring the ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12, we can measure how many thousands of years have passed since the animal died. Carbon dating works for fossils up to about 60,000 years old. For older fossils, scientists use unstable elements that have much longer half-lives. For Scientific American's Instant Egghead, I'm Michael Moyer.
Okay. So that is how radioactive dating works. Now on to the second field, which is medicine. Like I said, there's a whole separate, like, you've got like your surgery and you've got your cardiothoracic field, and then you've got nuclear medicine, which just focuses on all kinds of uses for radiation in medicine. An example of this application is cobalt-60 that is used to destroy certain types of cancer cells. We also use nuclear radiation in what are called radioactive tracers. I don't know if I pointed out that it was specifically nuclear radiation at the time, but in grade 10, when we learned about the Hershey-Chase experiment, if you're unfamiliar, it was when we were talking about what is the source of genetic information? Is it protein? Is it RNA? Or is it DNA? And at the time, you had these two scientists which used radioactive tracers to label the DNA of a bacteriophage virus and the protein coat of the virus. They labeled it with 2 different isotopes. One was phosphorus, one was sulfur. Then the virus infects a bacteria and they centrifuge, which means it's like they spin it around really fast and it separates the heavy materials on the bottom. So the bacteria would be at the bottom with the genetic material from the virus, and then the viral coat would be at the top because it would be lighter. And they use radioactive tracers to be able to follow. So that's why it says incorporated onto substances so that the movement of the substances can be followed by radiation detectors. So if we label the protein with either sulfur or phosphorus, I can't remember which one's which, and the DNA is the other one, and then we are able to follow where the phosphorus and the sulfur go. And then we figured out that basically the DNA from the virus was inside the bacteria. Therefore, the DNA was the genetic material. We can also use it to follow around like cytotoxic T cells. That's how we figured out that cytotoxic T cells can kill cancer cells and things like that. When you see these videos with like bright green colors or whatever, those are radioactive tracers. We can also use nuclear medicine to help diagnose cancer and other diseases.
The nuclear medicine department of a hospital uses radioactive materials every day. They're used to help doctors understand what's happening inside people's bodies. First, a radioactive material called a tracer is prepared in a specially protected area. It's designed to accumulate in a certain part of the body. This syringe contains a tracer called technetium-99m. It emits gamma radiation and is one of the most commonly used radioactive materials in nuclear medicine. Once the tracer is ready, it's injected into the patient. In just a few minutes, it'll accumulate in the target organ, in this case, the kidneys. The doctors are trying to find out if this patient's kidneys are functioning properly. Gamma radiation is very penetrating. It easily passes out through her body. She's carefully positioned over a machine called a gamma camera. It detects the radiation and pinpoints where it's coming from. A series of images are collected at regular intervals. The first image captured by the camera clearly shows the size and shape of the two kidneys. Now watch what happens over the next 15 minutes. The radioactivity in the kidney on the right has almost disappeared. This kidney has quickly got rid of the tracer, but there's still a high level of radiation being emitted from the kidney on the left. There's probably a blockage. The left kidney is struggling to get rid of the tracer. The radioactive material is inside the patient's body. Does this make them radioactive forever? To investigate, a syringe containing a fresh sample of technetium is placed into a radiation detector. At 9 o'clock in the morning, the radioactivity of the sample is 112 million counts per second. After 2 hours, it's dropped to 88 million. After 4 hours, it's 67 million. The level of radioactivity emitted from the technetium sample is gradually decreasing.
Okay, so you could see based on using the tracer there that one of her kidneys wasn't filtering the tracer out efficiently. So then they can identify problems that way. And finally, in agriculture, radioactive tracers in fertilizers can determine the effectiveness of a fertilizer. An amount of tracer absorbed by a plant indicates the amount of fertilizer absorbed. So it's the same same kind of concept as in medicine. If you want to trace where nutrients are going, nuclear radiation is also used to prolong the shelf life of food. So we can use gamma rays from cobalt-60 to kill bacteria and insects that spoil the food before they are packaged. You could also look at the UV treatment of drinking water as kind of the same thing. Even though the UV radiation is a lower, has a lower amount of energy, it's still used as like a, what do you call that? A disinfectant. There we go. Which is apparently why my former president said that we could just, expose the inside of your body to light in his infinite wisdom. Oh, okay. Anyway, sorry, I'm just trying to see. Okay. And the last couple of ideas for this section. The next section, I'm going to go into more detail about fission and fusion. But just for the moment, fission is a heavy nucleus splitting into two or more lighter nuclei. The products include the nuclei as well as nucleons from the fragment's radioactive decay. This is what powers nuclear reactors, including the ones that we find on aircraft carriers and submarines. Now, the advantage of nuclear fission is that it provides a crap ton of energy for very little waste, even though that waste, yes, is highly radioactive. But nuclear reactors provide tons and tons of power and relatively clean compared to burning fossil fuels. And it's much more efficient than both solar and wind power. So the problem we have at the moment with alternative forms of energy is that burning fossil fuels gives us the highest efficiency percentage-wise, whereas like things like gasohol, wind power, solar power, hydroelectric power, they're not as efficient. They don't give us as much energy for the input. Unfortunately, for a lot of people, they hear nuclear reactor and they freak out because you guys were too young when Chernobyl happened, but you were alive when Fukushima happened, which is still highly radioactive. But these are like pretty much the only two, I think, incidents which have happened in the whole history of having nuclear reactors. And that'll be part of the next section as well. Fusion is the opposite. This is when you have very high temperatures and pressures that are used to combine light atoms. We talked about it in astronomy in grade 10. This is the process that fuels stars. But creating and maintaining fusion is much harder than fission, mostly because even for the simplest type of fusion, being hydrogen, you need a temperature of 10 million degrees, and we just don't have any way of containing that on Earth. Both fission and fusion release huge amounts of energy that can be converted into heat and electric energy, but they both produce nuclear waste. This is what freaks people out. Fission produces more waste than fusion. So as new processes are developed to use energy from fission and fusion, how do we contain, how do we store, and how do we dispose of that waste? These are all questions that scientists are concerned about. So containment. Every radioactive substance has a half-life. The waste from medical research has a half-life of a few months or less because you don't need it to be radioactive for that long. It's very short-term, like being used in diagnostics, things like that. The waste product, the waste that's produced in nuclear reactors, which we use for power, will take hundreds to thousands of years to decay. So it needs to be contained so that we don't expose nature to this radiation. So there's two ways that they can do this. They can either have on-site storage or they can have off-site disposal. The most common waste form for nuclear power plants is the fuel rod, which you can see here. You've got on the left-hand side, the source of fuel for nuclear power plants is uranium. and they come in these little pellets that are put in the fuel rods. And basically the very basic, what do you call that? The premise behind a nuclear reactor is that you've got these highly radioactive materials that you put into what's called the fuel rod assembly. And these are going to produce a lot of gamma rays, which is energy, right? They sink them into pools of water to help to cool them, but it also produces steam, which then powers a turbine, and that's what creates the energy. Like I said, we'll get more into that when I talk specifically about how a nuclear reactor works. The fuel rods can be contained in above ground in water pools or in dry casks. So what you see there is a water pool. When the pools are full, the rods are removed into dry casks made of concrete and steel, which again is the materials that help to block the radiation. But of course, these are still only temporary storage. The disposal is done with the intention of never having to retrieve the material, which needs careful planning. In the US, there are 131 disposal sites in 39 states. I'm assuming that number is greatly different now. I'm not sure when this book was published. And I don't think Thailand has a nuclear power plant. I don't know if there's any nuclear power plants anywhere around Southeast Asia other than in Japan. I don't know. I'd have to actually research that because I don't know myself. We'll cover that